Well, good evening and welcome. We're doing something a little different with the other side for the next few weeks leading up to the Queensland State Election at least. We're going to be running special episodes of the show, just little other side extra clips. We're going to have different interview guests on to talk at length, a little bit more time than we have on the normal show to get into some of the serious issues about the election that's coming up. We're certainly going to be doing it for the next few weeks with the Queensland State Election, and we may continue beyond that as well. But we'll be uploading every Sunday night at 7:30, the special Other Side extra episodes. So we are coming into a cycle of elections in Australia in the next 6 months or so. The ACT Territory government is going to go to the polls on Saturday, October the 19th. They're next in about 2 weeks' time. They've got a 25-member Legislative Assembly to vote for. They've currently got a Labor-Green coalition government. Absolutely no surprises there in the bubble of bureaucrats. But the biggest one upcoming, of course, is Queensland, and that's the following Saturday on October 26. Western Australia goes in March, and the federal election has to happen before May. So quite a few elections in the next 6 months or so. Now, coming back to Queensland, it is a long-term Labor government that's looking to win a very, very unlikely fourth term. But is it as unlikely as everybody thinks? We'll be getting into that discussion tonight with our special guest. And they also have in Queensland the economic impact of COVID now really taking hold in the state and starting to impact the budget. We saw a $9 billion budget blowout announced. So Labor is looking pretty unlikely to hold on to power. For our American viewers, Queensland's a bit like Australia's Florida in terms of weather, but also in terms of tourism and being the retirement state. And the Labor government in Queensland is on the political left. To discuss all of this for the Queensland election, I'm joined by Dan Petrie. Dan is a former columnist and writer for News Corp at Queensland's Sunday Mail. He also is a former data editor at Bloomberg, and he now heads up all things data for mining.com.au. Dan, welcome to the Other Side Extra.
Thank you, Damian. Great to be with you.
So, mate, just an overview. I mean, I want to get into the real stuff, the nuts and bolts and the detail, but of course, election analysis always happens on two levels. There's the realities, sort of, how are things really going and what really should be happening, and then there's the perceptions. So just starting with the perceptions, it does seem like almost an impossible task for Labor to hang on to power, even though they have a new leader, right?
Yeah, like a lot of state governments and provinces around the world, those that are centralised or, don't have a great local presence tend to start suffering problems. Queensland's a very big state. Almost 5 million people live in this part of the world now. And again, when you start to break that down, its problems are very, well, not unique really. High youth crime levels have become a very, very difficult political challenge for the government. Now, you'll often see this data cut many very ways in terms of, as a head of 100,000 people, it's dropping, but you can't measure crime like that. It's actually in raw hard numbers, and the victims of crime are increasing. The state also, it doesn't really generate much. We don't attract new major investment in the form of, like big, huge companies don't come necessarily to set up here, and the ones that do often come through large government incentive. And then, of course, to top it all off, you've got really a state that is got an incredibly aggressive infrastructure program. But again, when you go down the path of sunken capital, you also have a lot of sunken dreams with that as well. So it's got a lot of debt now for a state which only 20 years ago was debt-free, and now it's, in my lifetime, Queensland, could top $172 billion of debt, over the forward estimates, and it's an incredibly large number.
A hell of a lot for a state of only 5 million people. And we saw, I mean, it's sitting at around about 120, 130 billion Australian dollars now, the debt, at 5% interest. That's about $6.5 billion a year just blown in interest. And
that's
we're talking about a state budget of only about 80 billion, right?
Yeah, that's right. So you're starting to look towards 8-7% of your revenue effectively having to pay debt. Now, of course, that debt figure often gets explained away as, a lot of it's on GOCs, government-owned corporations. They became quite in vogue in the 80s, the idea of the government competing with the private sector. But again, government-owned corporations tend to be utilities, water, ports, electricity, reliable, steady incomes, but also the perfect vehicle upon which to settle your debt on. So you don't get the
Right.
maintenance necessarily required or the reinvestment required. And so some of the the ambition around net zero and investing in solar farms seems counterintuitive when you own so much of pre-existing assets around coal, for example. But it's a strange strategy just to see a state which didn't have the quantum of debt it has now to go down that path is somewhat difficult to imagine. But again, Queensland's debt is actually, if you compare it among states around the world, it's incredibly high. And we're nowhere near the state of Victoria, which is, to be honest, a basket case.
Yeah.
So that's where we're looking at the moment. So it's the economics of Queensland are very, very challenging going forward.
All right. Now, the state is reliant upon tourism industry, but also coals. What are the big revenue generators for the economy and the big revenue generators for the government?
Well, look, metallurgical coal, so the state, on any given day can account for 50% of the world's steel making coal. That's the things which go into wind turbines and every steel product you can imagine. And the state has a long association and a long export partnership with the Japanese, particularly Japanese steel makers. Now, the state comes at a time too where you've got some of the highest royalties in the world. Now, that was, of course, the Treasurer Cameron Dick here in this part of the world said that he would not introduce any new state taxes or duties, but for some reason the mining industry did not get that memo, and since then it only applies to good old Joe Q public taxpayers, you and me, but not corporates apparently, and that's been a far-right issue, and I dare say that's probably going to play out quite badly for the government in the regions. Like, you just can't take billions and billions of dollars of resources company that make investment decisions that for a 30-year time frame introduce a stealth tax, and that's really what it is, and expect that there's not going to be any blowback. So I definitely think electorally that will not play well for the incumbent centre-left Labor Party.
So what's the royalties now in Queensland?
So it can, depending on the rate, it can get as high as 40% of a metric tonne. So seaborne coal, you think about it, can be anywhere north of $250 per metric tonne. So
40% is a big whack.
that's an
what would the
extraordinary
average
whack.
be? About 20, I suppose, would it?
Yes, yeah. So
Yeah.
that used to be tiered. They've introduced another tier. It's a progressive tax royalty regime.
And these are some of the
Unsurprisingly,
highest in the world. Is that right, Dan?
that's correct. Yes, and so now Queensland has been a reliable supplier of metallurgical coal. Now, just so viewers might be aware, coal exports coming from Australia total around $7 billion, $8 billion a month on the monthly trade data. The next highest one after that's iron ore, which can top 12 billion. Without that revenue, Australia really has very little to offer. We can talk about tourism, but their services related industries, they're hard to measure. Things such as, resources are really at its brutal, raw form, extraction and ship it out. It's product sold and doesn't employ that many people, but it generates enormous incomes for this country. And then to actually hand back that same level of money in the form of, cost of living handouts and electricity and all sorts of, household measures begs and speaks really of, political desperation more than anything else. But what it does do is it sends a terrible signal, like the issue of sovereign risk has become, written about more prevalently. But
Talk about sovereign risk, Dan. I mean, you're talking about that means that countries, investors, companies, global companies are not going to invest in Australia. They're not going to invest in Queensland specifically because they're concerned about the government. They're concerned about regulations. They're concerned about taxes. They're concerned about changes that could just be made at the drop of a hat. And so we're sending a signal to the world that this is not a safe and reliable place to invest. People will
also
recall,
sending,
the situation in New South Wales with the gold mine and Tanya Plibersek overturning that gold mine at the last minute. She claimed it was initially because of concerns about Indigenous issues. Then it became about environmental concerns. nevertheless, it sends a really bad signal to the rest of the world that if you invest in Australia at the very last minute, a politician can just decide to kind of change the rules or pull the rug out, and all of that work and all of that investment that you've put in getting it ready, just goes to waste. In Queensland, have you seen any actual impacts yet, or do you hear, in the mining world, are there people saying, we're not going to do a project, we're going to pull back, we're going to, not be investing as much in Queensland, we're going to look for other places?
Well, you can look at it on the ASX. There's one major coal company that's undergoing a refinancing option because they have to. Like, royalty payments are a massive part of their outgoing quarterly revenue reports. If you look at the likes of BHP have signalled they won't invest in any future projects here in Queensland. Whitehaven Coal has picked up a bunch of projects. You mentioned Tanya Plibersek's foray into stopping a gold mine based on the concerns of Indigenous stakeholders. Now, those Indigenous stakeholders have actually been at the table, and when that reasoning's put forward, it's those Indigenous stakeholders which are an honest partner in many resources projects around the country that are then basically tarred with this brush that they're obstructionists, when that's simply not the case. Coming back to the Queensland example, when you have a Japanese ambassador intervening, saying, we're incredibly disheartened by this, action taken by a state government, it's just an extraordinary foray. And so I suppose, like, from the perspective of, sovereign risk of what we were talking about before, Australia doesn't have much. I know people love to put this idea that, we're a land of plenty and a bounty of everything, but the truth of the matter is it's a rather difficult regulatory environment to negotiate because you're dealing with three levels of government. The laws aren't uniform, the regulations aren't necessarily uniform, and when it becomes all too hard, that's the opportunity missed.
I mean, at the moment, we've got this push to net zero, so obviously there's a lot of concern about coal mining and, selling coal overseas for electricity purposes, very different from the coal that produces steel, right?
Well, sure. So there's thermal coal, there's energy coal, metallurgical coal. In fact, there's no replacement for metallurgical coal, despite what you might read about hydrogen and various
and
types.
What percentage, mate, is of the coal that Queensland produces is metallurgic? Do you know versus
Queensland produces about 70 to 75% is steel making coal.
Right.
The other 25% is thermal coal.
Okay, so let's take that's coal. Now, what else has Queensland got to offer? Tourism, I suppose. That got
natural
heavily
gas.
Natural gas. Okay, let's stick with the resources for a second. So, natural gas, how's that doing?
Well, obviously that's tied to the oil price. So you'd probably argue it's had a pretty good run in more recent times. So natural gas is obviously a big one, and then of course you start getting into the other areas. Queensland's become not a bad manufacturing hub.
We've got a debt problem. We've got declining income from these sources. We've got government overspending, a $9 billion blowout in the budget. So things are not looking great. Do you think that the average Queenslander actually understands all of this? And is that really going to be what's going to be driving their voting?
Well, I think there's, I can't put a crystal ball on and say definitively what's going on, but I've got a pretty good idea. I mean, this is a small business state. That's probably the underlying statistic, which people is 450,000 small businesses, and that's 20 or less employees, and that's probably the big feature of it. But I don't think you can rule out the issue around crime has been such a significant headline grabber. Of course, I do think many Queenslanders are probably quite worried about the cost of living, and the state does really, it has a net migration of almost 1,000 people a week. Now you have to look at some of the problems which really do start to take hold. Business confidence is very low. The industrial relations environment is very, very difficult. So you've got unions with clearly far too much say in terms of what is a fair price for wages, and that's around construction. It's incredibly difficult to construct things in this part of the state, especially with an Olympics where there's no dirt being turned over for a stadium. That has been probably one of the great a planning misstep in line with where Boston faced. Do they go ahead with doing an Olympic bid? They pulled back because their price went from 5 billion to 15 billion. It's very difficult to see how a state such as this one in Australia can deliver an Olympics for under 11,
Yeah, we can talk about the Olympics all day
$12
long.
billion.
That's a scary proposition. I don't even want to get into it at the moment. But yeah, we'll hold that one for another podcast. I think it's a whole podcast in itself. Mate, I just wanted to, coming back to the personalities involved, if we just take a look at, Stephen Miles, the Premier, he's been Premier now for, is it almost a year? I mean, he seems to be becoming more popular. He wasn't very popular at the beginning. He couldn't be less popular than Anastasia Palaszczuk, the previous Premier. He's managed to distance himself quite a lot from Palaszczuk, and time has obviously helped with that. Do you think that in the minds of voters, they see Stephen Miles and they think Labor, they think Anastasia Palaszczuk, or do they see Stephen Miles and think, new guy, give him a go? As I had somebody say to me yesterday.
Well, he's a well-known quantity, Stephen Miles. He was around during the COVID period, of course. He's an environment minister. If anything, he's been a very, very effective campaigner, but he does face the problems that a third-term government face. They've been around a long time. He's been part of that cabinet table for a long time. They can have, this is in this part of the world, we've got free public transport, which sounds fantastic, but it's the same people paying for it. The voter, the taxpayer, is the one that pays for this.
It's Robin Hood policy. It's Robin Hood policy, like the $1,000 back on the electricity. It's just robbing Peter to pay Paul. Take it out of the taxpayers and give it to the people. It's just a redistribution of wealth, right?
Well, there is that, but then there's the thing which is really quite critical in all this. We talk about Anastasia Palaszczuk, a person who was enormously popular, but rather political in the way she approached that COVID period. There was clearly politics at play and polling at play in how that was done. The opposition were lead-footed in their approach to how they dealt with that. But the fact of the matter is this, whether Stephen Miles or Cameron Dick, the Treasurer, or David Crisafulli, the opposition leader, like it, there has been a distinct lack of economic reform at the state level and the service level for a very long time. And if we talk about crises, if you look at the Auditor General reports across the major portfolios of health, particularly education, where, the number one concern teachers have is whether they'll actually get out of the classroom alive in terms of just the threat to physical safety. In fact, that was one of the policy extractions that was delivered via a Courier Mail forum to the leaders this morning. $40 million to help teachers, to be safe in the classroom. You do have some significant social problems, and there's a lack of social reform. Finally, to look at this, really, is he really going to reform? If you look at, again, those Auditor General reports, so the independent body made to assess government policy, they're all in every government around the world. But Queensland is beset with terrible technology problems. They would rather put Band-Aids on antiquated, outdated IT systems because they're not very good at installing or ensuring that there's a process to bring them online. But those processes of bringing new tech online, ensuring that you've got good databases, high-quality data integrity, that saves billions. And if you look at the forward estimates, again, that's one of the major expense lines. And so you just cannot see, for example, how, for both sides of politics, are they prepared to articulate a strategy which looks at reform, which looks at social reform, which looks at the place in the economy and the strategy to go forward with it, instead of, at the moment, sloganeering around, climate change and that inability to define what exactly that is.
There's a lot of fear, though, in the Labor ranks about the Greens, right? You've got 2 Green seats in the state parliament already. One of them is in your sort of typical, excusable, I guess, inner city, South Brisbane area, which is, full of 20-somethings and lefties and hippies and, people that you would expect would vote Green because of a particularly distorted worldview. Then you've got another seat called Maywa, which is in the inner western suburbs, which is a Green seat and has been for 2 terms, I think.
Yes.
Formerly a Liberal Party seat, and this seat is the what I call the NIMBY rich Greens. These are the people I really don't like that much because they're the ones who've made their millions out of the free market liberal democratic system, and in retirement to be popular with the grandkids and to sort of make themselves feel virtuous, they go and vote for the Green Party, thinking that they're voting for an environmental party and doing something virtuous, but in actual fact not realising that what they're voting, or maybe realising and not caring, that they're actually voting for a very radical left-wing party with policies across the board affecting many things that are, take a very, very strong left-wing position. This is sort of eating Labor's lunch a bit. Do you think that there'll be more Green seats emerge? The protest vote against Labor might go towards the Greens in the absence of, and we'll get to this in a moment, but there seems to have been an absence of very good opposition coming from the Liberal National Party. But just on the Greens, first of all, what did you take?
The Greens, in terms of, if you talk about the Greens as a marketing machine, they're an outrageous success, in terms of the ability to attract voters to their causes. So, the Greens do, largely they enjoy that. I suppose they enjoy that popularity of being able to articulate policies that are rarely scrutinised, not well costed. They have not been able to demonstrate how they would replace, the incomes that are derived from the resources sector. In fact, you can't have wooden windmills capable of generating the electricity needed. And so
No.
It's a very, very
Well, it's a naive and somewhat sort of childish view of politics. And I think the Greens, I mean, in terms of whether they're economically sound and tangible as a managerially sound either as a party, I think it's pretty clear that they probably couldn't run the state very well, in my humble opinion. But I think that, the perception that they're a nice alternative to vote for, if you're normally a left-leaning voter, is leading people to just kind of make that sort of very, I think, irresponsible decision to just kind of throw a vote their way, and that could have an impact, right?
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, I read the tea leaves, and like I did for my time, spend a lot of time doing political analysis at Bloomberg, and green, environmentally, socially aligned parties perform exceptionally well at local government level, particularly in the councils, and we saw really that in the most recent local government elections, we saw the Green Party really as the major opposition force. In fact,
I think in that Brisbane area I was talking about before, in South Brisbane, West End, that area, where all the youngsters live and inner city workers live, that was I think 40-something% of the primary vote was Green. I mean, that's quite astounding to think that almost 1 in 2 people are walking into the booth and actually putting a 1 beside a party that has never governed, has no track record of government, and doesn't seem to, as I said, have that sort of economic or managerial capability set.
So you look at the metropolitan vote in the cities and where that vote is going. Again, this leads to the, if you are into betting or to forecasting, it's very difficult to see how the traditional Australian Labor Party, which probably shares a lot of its identity with the likes of the Democrats in the United States, for example, how they can actually attract enough votes within its metropolitan base to fall over the line, given the fact that they're so unpopular in the regions. And so it's a classic pincer, isn't it? They go down one path of saying, of championing economic credentials, but the other path trying to appease and trying to outdo a party which will always do them like a dinner on social policy. And so they've got some incredible challenges. They've got problems. But again, on the other side, you've got a centre-right party too afraid to articulate a policy out of fear of offending people. Now,
so I want to get onto that. The LNP. I mean, they have. I'm not sure that David Crisafulli has got the brand awareness that if we took a microphone and walked down the Brisbane City Mall, that many people would be able to actually tell you who the leader of the opposition in Queensland actually is. I mean, I'm guessing that, but I'd put money on it.
At the same time, he's not the incumbent, and probably that's to his advantage. And the LNP if there's one thing which has been impressive about their time in opposition, that they have been incredibly disciplined. Normally, when it comes to implosion and that playing out on the newspaper pages, they're very good at it. But the reality,
Yeah, they've had a lot of troubles, and it hasn't had the publicity that it might have otherwise had, which is a good thing from a discipline point of view.
Well, it's still a national party, really. If you peel back the layers, it's still really, it's got a very strong conservative country base. But by and large, the thing which we look at in all this is that the same set of challenges confront a Liberal Party should they win office, I should say, and that those challenges are incredibly significant. The crime issue we talk about, and particularly that's a byproduct really of a society where you've got kids they're walking into houses with knives, in some cases bashing up or threatening the homeowner. I mean, this is quite a critical junction you arrive at as a society when your house cannot be protected, where you fear the fact that the thing is so brazen is the act, they will walk in regardless of, and we've all got enough horror stories now of people we know where this has happened to. A potential will walk into a place they don't even know, despite the person being asleep, will wake them up, demand their car keys, and know that there's a court and a criminal justice system which is probably, they're at the end of the line, but they're not getting what the community expects in terms of the punishment proportionate with what the offence is. And this is a story on repeat. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think that, the one issue that the LNP has got some cut through on has been the crime issue, and the slogan was pretty good, I thought, about, adult crime, adult time. That will probably penetrate and win Christofouli a few votes. But when it comes to other matters, when it comes to the size of government, for example, and government spending and the debt and all those sorts of things, they've run a mile from articulating anything because they don't want to be labelled with the previous LNP government of Campbell Newman that, Labor has sort of cemented in people's brains that they did a very broad attack on the public service in trying to reduce the numbers of the public service, even though that was fairly targeted away from the front lines to a large extent and wasn't as big as Labor made out. Nevertheless, they managed to demonise Campbell Newman and use it to demonise the LNP for 2 more elections. They've even tried to raise his name again in this election. It's getting a bit ridiculous. But
it's
Christofouli and the LNP have been running away from that for a long time and not confronting it. And Christofouli has come out and said that he will not cut any public service jobs. If he's not going to cut public service jobs and reduce the size of government, how are we going to get this spending and debt and deficit in the budget under control, and then get the debt paid off and the interest bill paid and all the other stuff?
Well, you can't. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, the public service bill in Queensland's $35 billion. That's
half the budget, pretty much.
Yeah, like when 40% of when more than 40% of your outgoings are on wages. Now, I've been in some businesses. I've worked for corporations. I've been made redundant, and I've had some good businesses, and I've had some ones which I wish I'd gone surfing the day I looked at it, and I can't surf. But the idea that once you work for the civil service is that it's a job for life, and that's a cultural thing that should never ever be taken for granted was actually quite wrong.
It's a little immoral. It's a little unfair, and I think the trade-off was that you didn't earn as much as people in the private sector who took risk did. But nowadays, you've got, particularly among the non-frontline bureaucrat managerial class within the public service, you've got these enormous salaries commensurate with the private sector. In order to attract certain talent is the justification. But it beggars belief. The problem they've got, of course, is that we've got rising crime, so we don't want to be cutting frontline services. You don't want to cut frontline police. You don't want to cut frontline nurses and doctors when you've got ambulance ramping. So we've got to get brutal on the bureaucracy. We've got to get brutal on the red tape and the pen pushers and the people occupying offices, worrying about what pronouns they're using and things like that. I'm being slightly facetious and simplistic in saying that, but you get the drift, right? It's the red tape creators, the green tape creators, the rainbow tape creators, that are just the fat in the system that we cannot afford anymore.
Well, you start getting to the point of you have to. If the question is that what is the most prudent use of the taxpayer dollar? Now, I don't know necessarily about the activism within the public service. Of course, I'm aware of it. I worked as a journalist for a very long time. So, but to the broader point is the question, that is, the prudent use of the taxpayer dollar, is that being adhered to? And if it isn't, then you've got problems. And if you're not prepared to be able to, like everyone says, natural attrition will do it. Well, you have to be able to look at areas where, are there areas within government which could be quite easily handled by the private sector? There's nothing wrong with those questions. They're pertinent and they're quite pragmatic and sensible questions to ask.
But the LNP will run away from those questions, and it does require terrific leadership to be able to stand up against an electorate that doesn't want to hear it, right? And I do think the people of Queensland don't want to hear it, or a vast majority of people, apart from those that watch this show probably, don't really get it, and they don't really want to be told that the public service has to be cut,
But but Damien, if that's the case, then those people forfeit the right to an opinion. You have to be able to be honest about that. The government is not an infinite well of money.
No, I totally agree. I'm just saying that for the LNP trying to get elected, you can sort of understand why Christopher Lee is playing that small target game and not wanting to talk about anything, and that they have that discipline. I suppose that's good. But the alternative to that, of course, is to take a strong stand and to demonstrate some leadership. And my concern with his small target approach is that he's being almost an invisible small target. Well, invisibility could lead to defeat at the last minute.
I wrote a column on that very issue. The lack of, you need a plan, beyond, I think it was something like David needs a policy sling or some policy stones for his policy sling. And there was obviously a little bit of a couple of double entendres there and all sorts of things. But when I wrote that column, I was talking specifically about the fact that, Margaret Thatcher would often say, if you stand in the middle of the road, eventually you get run over. Now, the case in point there is the UK Labor Party, where the honeymoon is well and truly over for that political side. They've been lead-footed, rather soft on, some of the bubbling migration issues that have come across. And, the most powerful leadership anecdote I think I've ever read really is the famed Lee Iacocca, the automotive executive, who would speak about, taking people with you. And that's, rightly or wrongly, Bob Hawke was very, very good at being able to take a broad electorate and take them on the journey of what reform meant, why to do it. And again, you just couldn't, you can't imagine Australia with set prices for produce and that kind of planned system up to 1983, but it did exist. But what it does do is it creates all these inefficiencies in the system, and that was, much to Hawke's credit, he really did. I think, he's the last Labor leader, really, while Keating gets the chocolates, who really did articulate bold visions, particularly around abolishing the states and those things. And so these are big ideas which should never be discounted. They should not ever. You should never run away from such discourse. And in terms of the LNP not being able to articulate a position really about saying that everyone keeps their job, well, spare a thought for the poor private sector or the coal mining companies now no longer investing. What about those jobs? We don't protect those jobs.
Exactly. Yep.
And again, this is, and the Queensland government has just handed out a loan to a casino. This is the great irony of where we're at in Queensland at the moment. We have a casino next to the House of Parliament. Next to our executive building.
And what about the small business people? Are you coming back to them? People who are really suffering or really feeling it.
Well, but the small business as a block, it's very, very difficult to advocate for small business. For my sins, I actually did some time for the Chamber of Commerce in Queensland, and that was interesting in the sense that they didn't want to be too aggressive in their advocacy. That was one of the things which tended to frustrate me when I was there. Obviously, I didn't stay long after a couple of years, but the thing which the small business sector is the one that often has to absorb rather draconian levies, industrial relations policy, which is so prohibitively unfair if it's, if the backer of a government of the day is from the the union movement. So, that is basically the one constituency, for want of a better term, that has no say, that just has to cop it. And the idea that you can just keep raising levy after levy, tax after tax, and then handing that back to the rest of the population as a way of trying to buy their vote. And that's really what it comes down to.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, 50 cent fares, $1,000 electricity rebate, and, whatever else we need to give you to get you to vote for us.
Is it the best use? Is it the best use of the taxpayer dollar?
Of course not. No, it's terrible. And it's almost arguably unethical and immoral. I mean, I think you could make a case that it shouldn't even be allowed in an election.
Now, when I was at Bloomberg, I can remember very clearly the day when Greece, effectively defaulted. They elected a populist government that just said, no, we're not going to pay the loan back. And so that just sent shockwaves through. And then, it was actually Cyprus that, they had a bank which wasn't working. And that sent, the Dow and all those tumbling 4%. Now, the fact of the matter was Greece wasn't actually in that terrible position 18 months before that crisis that hit them. But the thing was, they had elevated debt. They basically, in Germany, and dialed up the pressure. You have to pay back your debt. And really, that's where...
Talk about sovereign risk, right? Talk about sovereign risk and sending the right signal and building trust.
Absolutely. And so you start getting these situations where if you can't talk about it, are we that muzzled by offending people and their sensitivities around having a job, the role of government, the budget? Are we that muzzled that we can't have the conversation? And the truth is, if you look at the volume, in fact, Queensland spends more on public services than New Zealand does. It's
incredible. And I mean, they're virtually the same size, I think, but still.
One's a country.
New Zealand doesn't have a federal government as well, right?
Yeah.
So we've got the LNP being probably inexcusably weak. Do these people, just to wrap up, I mean, I've heard the Australian Institute of Progress did some research, and the latest polls came out that said that the two-party preferred vote is now 55% LNP, 45% Labor, so it doesn't look like the LNP can lose. The AIP's research said that they've got to get that 53%, or they're not going to get a majority. If they don't get 53% roughly, they will end up in a minority government. Do you think a minority government is still possible? And do you think a minority government is actually all that David Crisafulli and the Liberal National Party frontbench really deserve at this point?
I won't be so strident in what they deserve.
I'm not saying it. I'm trying to put words in your mouth, Dan. Nor am I editorialising my questions. I never do that. This is an opinion show.
I would say this, a couple of things. I think a minority government would actually be incredibly interesting for one reason. The one bargaining chip, and that have to do with the Catters, right? The one bargaining chip the Catters would have, I'm not sure if they're that keen on this idea, but if they said, we'll give you supply and support and that type of thing, but you have to give us the 7th state referendum, that would be an incredibly energising debate and process to go through, and something I would love to see in my lifetime. Not for any other reason than I think that the states in their current form and federation, that's a debate well worth having, but obviously for another day.
That's the Katter Australia Party, of course, up in North Queensland, and you're saying that they might do a deal, but it might be with a string attached that you've got to have a North Queensland separate state referendum or something.
Yes, I'm deliberately telling Robbie Katter via this video that that's what they need, the bargaining chip, for no other reason than...
You're having a go at me for editorialising. You're driving policy agendas. All right, mate. We better wrap it up. Do you reckon, though, like on the balance of it, do you think it'll be a minority government, or do you think LNP will be able to get over the line themselves?
I think the LNP will. I do think that when the government's on the nose, are on the nose. I think we just don't know what Brisbane will do. Remember, the LNP hold 4 or 40 seats in Brisbane, and I suspect that they could do quite a lot better than they have in the capital.
Plenty of room for improvement in Brisbane itself.
Yes.
I don't look at the left side of politics that much, but are there any other seats apart from South Brisbane and Maiwar that the Greens could steal from Labor, do you think?
Well, I think you have to look at the corridor where there's some polling suggesting that the health minister, Shannon Fentiman's in trouble against the possible LNP, but she's out in the outer suburbs. But I think it's those areas, starting to go from Toohey and in the inner city, that go beyond into more the, not Mount Gravatt area, but more the Coorparoo area where Di Farmer is and Balimba. Those things, they're live options. They're very, very, very challenging because state elections, you don't get much seat-by-seat polling. And this will be kind of the wild swing could possibly be on.
Yeah, I mean, you don't get much general polling. So, the 55% could be way off the mark. You don't know. I mean, the margins of error for the poll might be a certain thing, but then we've had situations before, haven't we, where we've had absolute landslides that we didn't quite expect in both directions.
That's true. Yes.
All right, mate. Thanks very much for your time. We probably should wrap it up there, but we'll have you back. Probably next week and the week after, just to sort of keep this going. But we'll get some guests on as well, and keep our little other side extra Queensland election specials running on Sunday night.
We'll break the internet.
We'll break. Oh, it's going to be huge. It's going to be huge. All right, Dan. Thanks very much for your time, mate. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.